So, hello, I'm Megan D, and I'm the chair of graphic design, and I'm here today with Patrick Finley, another design faculty from Virginia Tech. And we're so glad you're able to join us with Kaleena Sales today. So today's lecture is a part of the Women and Minority Artists and Scholars Lecture Series, which was made possible through support from the Moss Art Center and the College of Architecture and Urban Studies. Kaleena will be speaking on expanding the canon, examining urban minority culture and design. She's an assistant professor of graphic design, although she's just finished submitting for tenure, and she also serves as the interim chair of the Department of Art and Design at Tennessee State University, an HBCU in Nashville, Tennessee. Her research focuses on the intersection of Black culture and aesthetics and investigates the ways in which identities and experiences impact design styles. As a member of the AIGA Design Educators Community Steering Committee, Kaleena has advocated for more inclusive views of design history through her Beyond the Bauhaus series, where she shares stories of those historically underrepresented in design. Kaleena also serves as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for AIGA Nashville and is the co-author alongside Ellen Lupton of the upcoming 2021 book, Extra Bold, a feminist, inclusive, anti-racist, non-binary field for graphic designers. Kaleena is also a prolific illustrator whose work that will be featured in the next issue of Communication Arts. I've had the joy of getting to know Kaleena through her talks at CCAC and AIGA conferences, and I've also gotten to know her through her service to AIGA. I truly believe that to be a successful designer, you must be both a good designer and a good person, and Kaleena is the embodiment of both. So please help me welcome Kaleena Sales.
Thank you, Megan. That was really nice. All right. I'm happy to be here. I will share my screen and get started. Okay, I hope that it looks okay on your end. Okay, good. All right, so as context, as Megan mentioned, I teach graphic design at Tennessee State University, which is an HBCU. It's a historically Black college and university. So the majority of my students are Black students who are studying design. And over the years, I started to notice some of the design choices that they were making and really some of the routine choices that they were making semester after semester, group after group. And I was curious about where we develop our aesthetic preferences. And in exploring that, I reflected on my own experience as a designer, and really the relationship between culture, socioeconomic upbringing, and minority status with design choices. And then kind of the subsequent reaction to that in the mainstream design industry. And so I titled this talk Expanding the Canon. And within it, I examined some of that urban minority culture and its relationship to design. So this is a map from the 1930s. It's a government map that shows the discriminatory lending process called redlining. And essentially what it was the areas of town were color coded to determine which had high African-American populations or minority populations. And those areas here are shown in red, and those were denied time and again loans from banks for homes or businesses. And so what we see now as a residual effect are neighborhoods that are still pretty secluded or from one another. So you have Black areas of town or Latino areas of town separated sometimes just blocks away from what we might call a white area of town. And so this is not a monolithic experience, but it certainly kind of describes a lot of the neighborhoods that a lot of the students that I teach come from. A lot of the students that I teach are from inner cities of like Atlanta, Chicago, Memphis, and a lot of their experiences are very largely surrounded around other Black people. So I thought about what do kind of the things that we take in daily, how do those things impact our design decisions? So there's something called the mere exposure effect. And it simply says the more you see something, the more you like it. And I looked through a few images of kind of urban landscape, and I came across these, and I want you to take in the visuals, the textures, and the colors. And so you see just kind of old signage, graffiti, colorful graffiti, textured walls, maybe signage that's old and rusted. And then I thought about that mere exposure effect a little bit more deeply, and there's something called subliminal exposure that really helps to explain it even further. So it says the mere exposure effect is even stronger when the words or pictures are repeatedly presented subliminally. So that is, even if you have no awareness that you've seen something a bunch of times before, you still end up liking it more. So I thought about this and I was really fascinated because I kind of compared it to if you grew up in a house where people smoked cigarettes, that smell of cigarette smoke might actually be comforting to you. If you grew up in New York City where it's really busy and loud, then maybe a really quiet place would not be very calming. Maybe the sound of noise and the traffic would actually be what you're not just used to, but what you prefer. And I think that's true for our um, visual environments as well. The more things that we see kind of on the day-to-day basis, they seep into our design aesthetic, and then they come out in our work. So I kind of paired together those images that I just showed you guys with a few other images, and I was really struck by the textures and the colors of this urban environment. So historically speaking, there have been many Black artists, visual artists, who have been inspired by their environments. So Romare Bearden did collage work, and you can see the inspiration from that urban landscape. Afrocobra is a 1960s art collective based out of Chicago, who was very inspired again by the community, and they created their own aesthetic based on the representation of Black people and what they deemed as Black aesthetic. And then we have Basquiat, who again was inspired by the community and really that street graffiti culture. And he used a lot of iconography. So we see that, historically, time and again, a lot of Black artists have been inspired from their environments. So I thought about, well, how does that relate to today? And so I thought about my students and even myself and the visual language of hip hop. And so this small section here is about a Houston-based design firm that I think really influenced an entire generation of urban design. So Aaron and Sean Branch were the founders of Pen and Pixel. They are brothers, and they developed a very distinct, blinged out, more is more style. The name of their firm is Pen and Pixel. And this is an example of some of the album covers that they created in the 90s for rap labels in the South. So Cash Money Records and No Limit Records. Master P, Snoop Dogg, other people were getting their album cover designs from these two guys. And so you can see this kind of beginning phase of this bling, over the top, layered collage, style, in your face kind of design style. And so in an interview, some of these are a little comical or quite comical. But in an interview with the brothers of Pen and Pixel, they were said to have been influenced by the early capabilities within Photoshop and wanted to really exploit what the program could do. There was a write-up in the New York Times about their work, And it says, its gaudy dreamlike album covers were like crass, lunatic vision boards, offering vibrant Photoshop collages of palm trees and pineapples, hummers and helicopters, skulls and city skylines, and diamond-studded goblets. And I think that's a pretty accurate description. I did actually own some of those album covers back in the day, to date myself and to embarrass myself. But yeah, they were pretty over the top. All right. And if we look at some current flyers and other album covers, even from today, these were just from a few years ago. You see the same techniques of the layering, the collage, the materialistic kind of iconography, um, and um, and a lot of those influences that Pen and Pixel had really being carried over even today. There's even a line of of chips or snacks called wrap snacks, and we see the same influences we have on the design in the center, the same blinged out text that we saw in some of the Pen and Pixel work. We see this sort of graffiti style lettering that's on the packaging to the right, and a lot of the very vibrant colors. So I really started to think about the psychology of aesthetics, and getting a little bit deeper into the way that we react to the images that we see. And so it says, objects that satisfy current physiological needs will lead to a positive aesthetic emotion, so pleasure. And those that oppose those needs will lead to negative emotions, like repulsion. So the example that I read about was, if you're hungry and you see an image of a slice of cake, that will seem appetizing. On the other side, if you are sick, or let's say you're not feeling well and you see an image of food, you will be repulsed by that same image. So depending on where you are, what your current physiological needs are, you will have a different reaction to the same imagery. So this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it categorizes all of the different needs that all of us need as humans, not specific to any particular demographic or age group. These are just the things that all humans need according to this particular study. So the thing that I was really drawn to was this esteem needs, this feeling of prestige and feeling of accomplishment. And I thought about that in relation to even the album covers that were showing the bling and the cars and the mansions and all of that. And I thought, to those to those artists who were doing the album covers, that was a representation of a feeling of accomplishment. That was a representation of prestige. And it's just visualized in a really different way than for someone else, although it's the same core human need. I looked at imagery, and I want you to think about, as you're looking at these images, what your reaction is to it. So for example, if you are pregnant, you may look at this image and feel really happy or excited. If you are a new parent and wish that your child were sleeping, you might have a different reaction. Same here. If you are well off, you may have either indifferent feelings about this image, or if you are not very well off, or if you're struggling maybe to make ends meet, this might have a different reaction for you, or you may have a different reaction to this. I think all of us feel differently looking at this image today than we may have just a year ago. The feeling of wanting to travel, is it aspirational, versus maybe a year or two ago, if you traveled a lot, maybe this was exhausting and you were ready to go home. If you are recently divorced, you will look at this image differently than if you are newly engaged. So the point is, when we create images, not all of us will have the same reaction. Not all of us will feel the same way about it. And some of that has to do with where we are in our lives. And some of it has to do with our socioeconomic status and our identity. So continuing on, I started to notice this aesthetic duality happening in a lot of urban Black design. There was kind of a dual focus on again, that feeling of wanting to represent prestige. So there's the bling, there's the gold, but then there was also street elements as well, that, um, represented, sort of that urban tough, aesthetic. So we see that in the Rick Ross album cover with his, expression, but then also his fancy attire, right? And then we see the Missy Elliott album cover with the brick wall. So there's these like, kind of interplay of these different, um, textures and aesthetics kind of happening all at once. And again, I think representing, just the needs of a particular, people. These are other examples of the same thing. I began looking at my students' work, and I thought, well, let's look at their work, let's dissect it and see if this actually, is true, and how does it play out. So some of these are snapshots of urban landscape on the left, and then on the next few slides do the same thing. And then these are, little cropped in images of student work on the right. And it's striking the similarities, and the parallels. You see this graffiti style lettering, kind of almost matching almost exactly with the image on the left, the textures of this like rusted playground, and then a student, who chose some similar textures in the brushwork in one of their logo designs. Again, another, kind of like, homage to like graffiti style or block lettering. So when I paired some of those, images of urban landscape next to my students' work, you can almost not tell which one is which because of the carryover and really the inspiration from the environment. So what is the problem then, right? So the problem comes when we're entering a design field that is governed largely by Eurocentric standards. When we enter design school, um, we're taught, modernism, we're taught Bauhaus, we're taught international typographic style, sans serif typefaces, and those are beautiful things. But then when you look at the comparison to the images on the right, you start to wonder, where does that leave a designer or a student who's learning about design, um, in having to kind of compensate for maybe their natural preferences or aesthetic choices in favor of the things that they're newly learning in school. Um, in my in my research, I determined that there were some differences that were starting to, become noticeable in international typographic style. We preach simple compositions and sans serif typefaces, flat colors, and it's described as being, having logic over emotion, just making sure that it's communicating very clearly. I noticed that in a lot of the Black or urban aesthetic that my students were interested in, and even in some of the older examples of the artwork from Romare Bearden, for example, or Basquiat, there were complex compositions, expressive or ornate or bold typefaces, and then textured and layered backgrounds, and a preference for symbolism and iconography. So the question was, is there a right or a wrong here? Is there a place where these things can coexist? Um, there's a term called Eurocentrism, and that's defined as this: it's a worldview that's centered on Western civilization, or a biased view that favors it over non-Western civilizations. Um, and the problem with that is that singular narratives really carry the lie that we all value the same things or gauge success through the same lens. And as we see, that's not necessarily true. I did a Google search for top graphic designers, and this is a sampling of what came up, the first like 2.5 rows. And there were, no Black designers and very few like, minorities of any kind. And so I thought about, what is the message that communicates to up and coming designers? Is there only one voice or one style that is deemed professional or appropriate or good design. I thought even more about, just beyond aesthetics, our interpretation of words and their meaning. There was an assignment I gave. This is student work from my class. And I assigned a few years ago a logo design. The students came up with the name of the brand called The Yard, similar to campus on an HBCU campus. And so the assignment was to do an urban and trendy boutique. The student on the left was from the Middle East, and this was her interpretation of the logo design assignment. The student on the right was from Memphis, Tennessee, very urban area. And this was her interpretation of the assignment, just very visually different. And I thought it was really striking to see the choices that they were making. Even more so, this was from a typography class, and the students were using song lyrics to do poster designs. And so the assignment was to do an expressive type poster. And the student on the left was a white student, and the student on the right was a Black student from Memphis. And I just started to really notice some of these differences and just the choices that they were making. Again, neither one wrong, but thinking about where they fit within kind of our typical expectations of designers and their portfolios. Another example, I think the student on the left is Puerto Rican actually, and the student on the right was a Black student, again, from Memphis or Atlanta. I see the textures and some of the influences that I was noticing in a lot of the other student work. And then I think this might be the last one of the student work. The student at the top was from the Middle East, and the student at the bottom is a Black student from Atlanta. And what I thought was really interesting, they were asked to do an upscale restaurant, and the student at the bottom is a really great designer. I thought his interpretation of upscale was interesting, to use gold as a representation of that. And then the student from the Middle East did not feel inclined to do that, and her color choices were really different. In comparing, I sort of grouped these according to where the students were from. And I noticed some differences in the aesthetic. And when these students are putting portfolios together and they're going out for jobs, I thought about the gatekeepers of the industry, the creative directors, the hiring directors, recruiters, who are hiring young designers. And I wondered about their reaction to the portfolio set on the right, and if those design choices would be deemed good design. I think too often they're not taken seriously, and it really, I think, pushes us to rethink what we consider to be good design, or sort of who gets to make the rules. So there is, I'll try to speed up a little bit, quite a bit more. So I'll speed up. So there's something called unconscious bias that I think we're all familiar with. But the question is, how do our subjective preferences surrounding style interfere with our ability to give objective criticism? And I think that's beyond just like instructors or hiring directors, but even for ourselves as we're designing work. Do our biases, interfere with our ability to determine if we've made a good design choice or not? Implicit bias also is often defined as a prejudice or unsupported judgment in favor of or against one thing, person, or group as compared to another in a way that's usually considered unfair. I thought about the presidential portraits that were done over the years and how they typically look like the two on the left. And Kehinde Wiley's interpretation of Barack Obama for the presidential portrait and how strikingly different the visual was. And then also the reaction that people had to that. It was highly received in some communities and certain art worlds, but there was a segment of the population that was not sure if it was presidential enough, and if the aesthetic went too far. These are some other examples of Kehinde Wiley's work on the right, where he does a twist on some really classic pieces. The same content, different aesthetic interpretation. And we're asked to question ourselves and our reaction to that to see if we have any bias, and then if there's any reason why the piece on the right would not be deemed as high art versus the one on the left. So very quickly, I'll show you some really embarrassing old design work that I have done just to support the same line of thought. So on the left was just a really quick like freelance graphic design flyer for a client called Cozy Mill. The one on the right was like maybe 10, oh, there we go, 11 years ago. And if I could zoom in, yeah, I think I can zoom in. This is not something that I would have ever shown in a design portfolio if I were looking for a job. However, I mean, there are things there that still hold up to the piece on the right. There's hierarchy there, it's clear, you can understand what's going on. So it passes sort of those same rules that we say matter in design, but for some reason, it makes me feel uncomfortable to show it in a design portfolio because of fear of being judged that it was not worthy to be shown or did not pass some sort of a baseline test. And so these are some other examples. On the left is a small ad for a bank in Kentucky years ago when I worked as an art director. The one on the right was a brochure for a Black bank. There's some subtle urban aesthetics, I think, that are in play here to the right, the sort of angles and lines and shapes that are being used. These are icon comparisons of the ones on the left were some things, again, for the brand Cozy Mill that were just simple. I think fall more in line with the things that we either teach or do in design spaces. And then the one on the right was a more illustrative, kind of illustrative logo design for a client who wanted a personal branding, but it uses this gradient inside of this script lettering. And it's something that I may not have suggested for my own students to do just years ago. And I may have pushed them to do more flat tones. And so those are the things that I'm even having to rethink and question and say, well, why does, why can't there be a gradient, or why can't there be a little bling there? Or why, what are those things communicating that's not appropriate? And if it is appropriate, why are we afraid to sort of embrace those design styles? And so here's another quick example. Some print ads that I did years ago for Daytona Beach when I worked as an art director, and then a small snapshot of a book cover design on the right that again uses some of those urban elements that I did not connect at the time, but like in reflecting back on my work, I realized that they were there. And what really became interesting to me about this was that I felt like I was sort of developing two aesthetics. I was working, I could develop work that was flat and clean and streamlined and followed a little bit more of like the modernism style. And then I could also develop work that had an urban kind of edge to it. But the unfortunate thing for me was in realizing the way that I valued each of those kind of pieces. In my mind, the work that was urban wasn't good enough to put in a design portfolio. And so those are the things that it took a while for me to rework and relearn. I'm going to probably fast forward through some of this. This is Matisse's painting. These are two examples of paintings by Matisse that had the same subject matter, but use completely different forms to communicate the same things. And so we have an abstracted piece over to the left, and we have a more representational piece to the right. And they both show a boy at a piano learning music. But we can see how differences in style really can communicate completely different feelings when someone is, taking in a piece, even though the content is the same. So I just thought that this was a really interesting example. Very quickly, I thought about the ways in which we learn the principles of design outside of a classroom. And I really believe that, by the time we've entered school to study design, we've already been introduced to the principles of design in our everyday lives. So this was kind of how I learned about color and about shape and about so many other things, proportion. And it also dates me quite a bit. But I used to read these, magazines when I was younger, and and although shows like Fresh Prince or Martin are not specific to just Black audiences, I would say that if you a large part of the Black community did grow up or did consume this media as a part of their kind of upbringing. So I looked at 90s R&B group Escape in their clothing, the oversized kind of clothing, and I thought about, was that where I learned proportions, or what was the influence of scale relationships? So I broke that down into these shapes over to the right, to consider, like, the simplification of those shapes and those forms, and how that really translates to some of those principles of design. I looked at the clothing here by Dapper Dan. If you don't know who Dapper Dan is, please look him up. He's amazing. But he was not trained, but he did a lot of kind of like his own design, fashion design work. And this is an old photo of Bobby Brown. And I looked at the shapes, and I thought, well, this could be, an abstracted, Matisse painting or something. So, and same here with the Salt and Pepper clothing and colors, and I thought about that looks sort of like a Mondrian, painting. So, I think that the way in which we value certain things can be reshaped based on maybe the examples that we use or the way that we talk about it. Why is this not considered, worthy to study for color theory versus, some other things that we read about in our textbooks. I thought about even things like repetition, and Black hairstyles and braids and other things. And so I think that we see these things in our environment. I think that if we again talk about them and reference these images and these examples from urban culture the same way that we do with I think European examples in our textbooks, we'll start to value them differently. So Paul Rand has a quote, says, "Intuition is a flash of insight conditioned by experience, culture, and imagination." And I think that that's true. These are some examples of just things that I was playing around with years ago with patterns. And at the time, it was just visual play. But I didn't realize until I looked back on it how much of it was really sort of influenced by all the colors and textures and different things that I've even consumed over the years. And so this almost reminds me of graffiti in a way, and I didn't think of it that way when I was doing it. And then this sort of diamond exploration. So what are the benefits of diversity? I think gaining unique conceptual and aesthetic perspectives, exposure to different visual influences, access to a variety of cultural experiences, and really it helps everyone to fight against systemic underrepresentation. This I will fly through, but these are examples of how art and social justice can, work together. We have a class at TSU where the students do portraits, poetry and politics, and this is from the fall 2016 season or political season, and the students wrote poems and did artwork. But it really just illustrates that, beyond traditional design work, we can use our work to elevate issues that matter. There's an alumni from our department who created an art collective called North Art Collective based on North Nashville, which is a historically Black area of town. And they do these murals around town, and a lot of it kind of highlights some of the stories within the community. And so this is just another really good example of ways to use art or design to, elevate issues again that matter. This particular mural celebrated some of Black history in Nashville. And then I am coming to the to the close. Design and advocacy. I think the design can be more than just what we're doing, in the design software. So it's not just print design or UX, UI, and all of that. It can be writing, it can be research, it can be storytelling. And when I thought about design in that way, it really woke me up to so many more possibilities. And I think for anyone that's listening, that's, I would encourage you to think beyond just kind of the traditional design world. If you're thinking about ways that you can make a difference, you can start, again, writing. You can start really doing some non-traditional things. So this is Beyond the Bauhaus series that is ran through the AIGA Design Educators community. And it's a series of articles that really share stories of underrepresented groups and people and contributions to the design world. This is a book that will be released in May that I'm excited about, and has a long title, but it's a feminist, inclusive, anti-racist, non-binary field guide for graphic designers. The wonderful Ellen Lupton brought me in to work with this alongside a bunch of other incredible designers and humans. And it looks at theory and history and work, and it really pushes us to recognize other narratives and to expand definitions and to understand people. These are some examples from the book. There's wonderful illustrations that talk about those really interesting intersections that we don't oftentimes discuss. So, the intersection of poverty and racism or sexism and so forth. And it talks about, even challenges of a young designer that is starting out in their career and, the different people that you meet along the way. There's some wonderful interviews, and what I really love about it is that it expands the voices of who's included in the conversation. And so there are designers and people that you may be familiar with, but then that you may have never heard of, and they're interviewed and they share their experiences and voices in this book as well. This is a really quick, this is a poster that's included in the beginning of the book, and it says, "May this crisis dismantle all of our faulty assumptions and force us into new terrain." And I love that. It's designed by a designer named Elaine Lopez, who's amazing. And then this is just some of my own illustration work. I drew the image on the right and combined it with some images that I think represent some of the challenges that Black women in particular face. And so I also did a series of portraits over the past year that are particularly quiet and maybe stoic even, but I think that they kind of demonstrate some of the strength and beauty within the Black community. This is John Lewis. But a lot of these images, I did this one this weekend, but a lot of these images are just regular people. And so I think some of them show stories just even within the eyes. And so it's not design work, but it's work that I've been doing and that it feels related to just kind of like my overall interest and passion. And then just very quickly, this last quote here, and this is the end. I love this quote by W.B. Du Bois, and it says, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings." And that's it. Thank you. Sorry if I went over my time. Okay.
You are perfect. This has been phenomenal. And I wanted to, well, first of all, thank you. But if we have some time for questions as well, we already got a couple. So one was by Michael Borowski, who said that this is making me think about social media algorithms and how mere exposure might be less about where students are from, but very determined by who they like and follow. I'd love to hear any thoughts or curiosities you've had about that, and that he's really enjoying this.
Oh, thank you. That's a really interesting point. I think that's certainly true. We can almost curate our experiences, right, on social media. That algorithm, once you follow, certain types of pages or people, you're, suddenly seeing all of that in your feed. But that is really interesting. I think there's like the natural, organic kind of interactions that we have with the visual landscape in our communities, and like the people that we see, the places that we go. But then there is this like online, this visual landscape online that doesn't necessarily match that. You can almost choose your visual landscape. That is really interesting. I don't know that I have an answer for your question, but I do think that's an interesting point.
Yeah, we had another question by our student Emily. Where is the line drawn between appreciating and appropriating African American art? And how can you recognize and amplify African American art without appropriating?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's one I've gotten before, and I'm not sure that I've figured out the right answer for that. But I think that I think appropriation is a problem when something is being passed off as like your own without the acknowledgement of where it comes from, right? And so if you're doing design work that's inspired by, I don't know, urban design, or even a Black designer who might have a specific aesthetic, it's just sort of giving nod to, that person, and um, not doing it in a way that makes it seem like you've created, you've created that thing on your own. And so a lot of it's about acknowledgement, I think. Um, and then what was the last part of the question?
And how can you recognize and amplify
Oh, okay, yeah.
American art without appropriating?
Yeah, I think amplifying is I think sometimes just sharing work out even on your own platform. So I've seen a lot of people do a really great job over the past maybe few months or year of using their own social media feeds to share work of like Black designers or other minority groups that they wouldn't typically do. I think it's sharing space, and even honestly, like one example is Ellen Lupton, who's accomplished, amazing author, inviting other voices like myself into the fold, and into, and um, sharing power, sharing, giving us a platform to share our stories in an equal way that really helps to create equity. So I think it's just kind of elevating voices that way, like, whenever you have an opportunity to do that.
Yep, wonderfully answered. And I think too, I mean, whenever you're looking at work, make sure that you're recognizing it. But I think some of that self-awareness to that point too. One thing you brought up was the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And when you put up that slide, it really resonated with me in this current moment, because I think about all of the things students are going through and faculty right now. And so that second one up, safety, we don't necessarily have the safety, and with the protests of last year and ongoing fights for equality, like how do you address that and make your students feel safe so they can be creative?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, so if you think about, I guess what I'd like to say about that point is safety looks different, again, for different groups, and the way that we feel safe or the way that we feel unsafe, feels different depending on your experience, maybe even within this country. And so I love Maslow's hierarchy of needs for that reason, because I think it reminds us the things that we have in common. I think sometimes we strive for those different things in different ways. And so one person's approach to gaining safety might be protesting and then, and doing murals, and that advocate for certain issues. Another person might believe that's being unsafe, and so our viewpoint of those same things can make us react very differently. But I think at the core, we all sort of want those very same things. But for my students, we have a class called Arts and Social Practice. And a lot of times, you know, I challenge the students in that course to develop work that advances issues that matter to them, you know. And we do that by hopefully educating people about our points of view, about their points of view, sharing insight. I think that by sharing like experiences and stories, it helps other people to relate. You know, I've been one of those people, like I've kind of said a few times, I think we have more in common than we do that separates us, but the ways in which that looks it just might appear very differently. So through design, through art, we can share stories and experiences and hopefully make those connections.
Well, this was not a question. It was just Ben had said that this was wonderful and very insightful. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I really appreciate too within this space that you have presented many things in which you don't necessarily have definitive answers or solutions for, but I think sometimes opening the door to conversation where we might not have clear answers all the time is really important as well.
Yes, I'm I'm trying to learn every day, and there are even times where I might look back on my own work from 2 years ago and see areas, you know, where I got something not quite right, or I may have learned something since then, and I think, oh man, you know, and so I think it's just about trying to have, you know, these open conversations and trying to expose ourselves to other points of view and reading and learning. And so I'm certainly not at the point where I feel like I know all the answers. I don't think I'll ever get to that point, but I think that, you know, all we can really do is hopefully try to kind of go in the right direction. So.
Well, and I think that's important for everyone, but particularly for designers. You know, as much as you can understand about the world and learn about the world, I think it makes you a better designer. And in addition to that, I think there's something about that sensitivity to the world and noticing things, you know, those photographs that you'd taken and finding those patterns and seeing it as it relates to your student work. How would you advise students open themselves up to notice those sorts of things within the world?
Yeah, I think it's sort of kind of deciding that you don't want to just um I guess do things just because they're routine or just because like you know it's really stopping to challenge the things that you're learning and the things that you are, you know, perceiving, and that can be difficult because a lot of us just kind of go through the go through the day, go through our years, and we just do you know, whatever is expected of us. And so I think it takes some courage, some courage sometimes to stop and challenge some of those like routines. I think that there's some ideologies and some practices that exist in society that really thrive on like indifference and thrive on sort of um, the reliance that people won't stop and and challenge it. And so yeah, I don't know. I think it's just kind of like making the choice to be more um observant, you know, of your environment. And so once you do that, it's like your, you know, your eyes are open and and you're seeing almost more than you want to more than you want to see. So
Yeah, there is that fine line between compartmentalizing and not seeing that something you see on a walk can impact your daily
right.
life or your work as a designer, but also you're allowed to take a break.
Yeah, yeah. We all need to.
Well, this has been absolutely phenomenal. I really appreciate you being with us here today and all the work that you're doing, and I look forward to seeing what you do next.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining. I
Thank you.
appreciate it. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.